In today's tutorial, we'll be making a slab built pot. So you'll learn how to slab build with clay, and then we'll be using flowers for decoration on the surface, and we'll be pressing them into the surface of the clay to leave the outline of the flowers. And then I'll also be teaching you a slab building technique, which is a pottery making technique that allows you to create forms such as pots and things like that doesn't require a wheel, but it has a few more tools than something like pinching or coil building. So the things that you'll need for slab building is a rolling pin, or it could be a wine bottle I've used before, or something you can roll your clay out with, but usually you have a rolling pin at home. So a tube, this is a little bit of a tricky thing to come by, but what I found works really well is a Pringles tube, so that way you get to eat Pringles as well. So a Pringles tube with the bottom cut out works really well. Make sure you do cut the bottom out, because you'll find out later that if you don't, the tube will get stuck inside your form and create a bit of a mess. Some newspaper, a ruler, preferably like a 30cm ruler, and you'll see why in a little bit. A knife, again, not a super sharp knife. If all you've got is like a butter knife, that might do, but also not as sharp as a kitchen knife. A paintbrush, a card, loyalty card, so these are really good to have around. Usually you've got one in your wallet, so something like that. This is an old library card that I've used time and again for pottery. A sponge and some water. And then most importantly, we want our leaves to create the impressions in the surface of our clay. It's nice to have something that's quite rigid and not too thin, because thin leaves won't leave much of an impression on the clay. So things like flowers, dried flowers, things like that are really good for pressing into the clay. So the first thing we need to do is cover our tube in newspaper. So our tube is going to act as a form for us to form our pot onto once we've rolled our slab. So it's really, really important that you put the newspaper on the tube, otherwise the tube will get stuck and all of your hard work will go to waste. So I'll show you how to remove the tube after we've made our pot, but for now just trust me, it's going to make our lives a lot easier. So I'm just rolling the newspaper around the tube like so, and then I'm just going to take the end and tuck it in. So as long as one end of your tube is covered and then it's tucked, then we're sweet and we can move on to the next part. We can start rolling our slab now. We're going to roll our clay nice and thin, and then we can use that slab that we've rolled to form our pot. So I'm going to take my rolling pin and I'm just going to create a nice pressure. Don't push too hard, because what happens is you get a horrible ridge and then it's hard to roll that evenly then. So just nice even pressure. And it's really important to do this on a surface that the clay's not going to stick to. So don't use like a plastic cloth or a table surface that the clay is going to really stick to, or a plasticky surface. So wood or tea towel is really good, something like that the clay will come off. So I'm just going to keep rolling, and then once it starts to get a little bit flatter, I'm just going to flip it over and then keep rolling. So just try and get your clay a nice even thickness. You want to end up with about, I would say 3 mil, something like that. If you think about the mugs you have in your cupboard, they're not super thick. The walls will be quite thin. So we're not aiming to be maybe that thin, but make sure your clay is not too thick either. Now we've got our slab, I'm just going to make sure it fits around the tube. And it does. And then we need to cut it to shape. And then we're going to use our flowers to press into the surface of our slab so that we get the nice impressions of them in the clay. So I'm just going to use my ruler and my knife just to cut off the edges. But keep your rectangle of clay as big as possible so that we don't cut it too small to form around the tube. So I'm just going to cut each edge like so. So now we've got a nice rectangle of clay. and we can start to put the flowers on the surface and have a look at how we're going to design it. So I quite like to just place them down in quite like a natural way, just kind of vertically like that. You can always sort of move them around and see what looks most effective as well. So once you're happy with how they're arranged on the clay, you can use your rolling pin just to gently press them into the surface. So start at the bottom, and then we're just gonna gently press them in. So you don't want to be making your slab much bigger than it was before. The aim here is just to get the flowers and the plants just to stick nicely into the surface of the clay. And don't worry if it misshapes the clay a little bit, we can always trim that off again. So now is the satisfying bit where we can take the flowers out and see the impressions they've left in the clay. So do this carefully. It doesn't matter if some of the leaves fall off and end up being stuck in the clay, that's fine. But what you should get is a really nice, strong outline of the plants that you've pressed into it. And at this stage, you can imagine that if we'd used really thin leaves, there might not be such a strong impression left in the clay, which is why it's important to use the kind of thicker plants. There we go, so I've got my slab now and I'm ready for the next part. As I've rolled the flowers into the surface of the clay, it's just got a little bit wobbly again, so I'm just going to use my ruler and my knife, as I did before, just to trim that bit off. And the same on the bottom. Now we're ready to make our slab pot. So I've got my tube with my newspaper on, and I'll show you the next step. So carefully line up the tube to the edge of the bottom edge of your slab, and then we're going to pick up the end of the slab here, and we're just going to roll it, making sure that those edges are always in line around the tube. There we go. And then you can just kind of roll the clay together a little bit just to press it, but don't blend it too much because we're going to need to cut it in a minute. So that is your slab pot. And now we're just going to get this edge put together, and then we can put a bottom on it. So I'll show you how to do that. So now we need to blend the seam where we've got the overlap. Pull back that overlap. I'm just going to use my thumb to press the one edge into the tube, and then we're going to push that back over, and then with our knife we're just going to cut at a slight angle towards that seam all the way down, just to get that excess clay off. So now I'm just going to wet that edge to make sure that it sticks together nicely. So I'm going to take my wet paintbrush and just get that clay a little bit wet, and then we can push it together. So be quite nice and firm here, and once it's kind of roughly blended, we can take our card and just use that then to just make sure that seam is all blended, and you can't really tell that there was a seam there to begin with. Now we've made the walls of our pot, we've formed it on the tube. Now all we need is a bottom. So we're going to put this to the side, somewhere safe, we're not going to knock it over, and we're just going to get some more clay. And just like you did before, just gently roll it out into a slab. So this one doesn't need to be a rectangle, it can just be a rough square or circle. We just need enough to cover the bottom of our pot. So I'm just going to roll that out, and make sure you keep flipping it as well so it doesn't get too stuck to the surface. And once I'm happy with the thickness, which needs to be kind of the same as the pot, I'll just stop rolling. I'm happy with that slab, it feels nice and even, and it's about the same thickness as my pot. So the next step is to place your pot on top of the slab, like so, and then we're going to take our knife and I'm just going to cut around the edge. It's really important when you do this not to cut too much under your pot because you won't have enough to blend into the sides. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go a few mil out, or not even a few mil, like maybe 1 or 2 millimeters. And I'm just going to really carefully cut around the shape of the bottom. Okay, so once we've cut that bottom out, I'm just gonna take off that excess clay carefully, not to rip it. So now we've got the bottom of our pot, we can blend it together and then we'll have a full pot with a bottom, and then all we need to do is take out the tube. So to put the bottom on, we're just gonna wet the clay a little bit. So just get that clay a little bit wet. And then I'm going to take my tube with the pot on and I'm just going to press it onto the bottom. So don't press too hard here, you don't want to smush the clay, it's just about getting it nice and stuck. So instead of pressing on the top, what I like to do is just give it a little wriggle back and forth, and that just allows that wetness to kind of stick it together. So just to finish that off now, I'm going to take my card and I'm just going to blend the clay together, just carefully to not disrupt the impressions of the leaves. So just be careful of that. I'm going to go all the way around, and it's kind of like a flicking motion. If you drag it up, it's just going to leave all that clay on the side of your pot. So you just want to kind of flick off the excess clay from the bottom. And just get that nicely blended together. We'll tidy it up afterwards as well. So at this stage, it's just about getting it nice and stuck. And something I like to do as well is just to flip it over, and then I can kind of use my card to just tidy it up like that. And we can also get our damp sponge and just use that to smooth the bottom as well. Now we've blended all the edges and it's nicely stuck together. We've got our slab built pot with our flower impressions. What I'm going to do is let that dry for a couple of hours, just make sure that it's nice and strong for when we take the tube out. So I'm just going to leave that uncovered just to dry a little bit. Now I've let my pot dry a little bit, I can take the tube out. So this is where the newspaper is really essential, because if it wasn't there, your clay would just be stuck to the tube, and it is the worst thing to try and get it out. So the newspaper allows us just to wriggle the tube out really nicely like that. And then you can leave the newspaper in for a little bit just to keep that form so it doesn't warp or shrink in a weird way when it dries, but I'm going to take it out just to show you. So you can just really carefully pull it out, and then it should just come out really nicely. Okay, and there we have it. There's the slab built pot with leaf impressions. I've learned how to slab build today, which is a really big accomplishment with pottery. It is a little bit tricky, there are a few knacks, but just try again, go back in the video if you get stuck at any point. I really hope you enjoyed it and that you are happy with what you came up with, but the most important thing is that you enjoyed the process and you learned something. So thank you very much for watching today's tutorial.